Hunting down Islamic State in Syria. Barack Obama authorizes attacks against Islamic State's fighters inside the war-torn country. But does that mean Obama is dragging his country into Syria's conflict? And how will he deal with the alleged danger posed by IS fighters? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. US President Obama has laid out his strategy for dealing with the Islamic State group, and for the first time, that will include targeting the group's fighters in Syria as well as in Iraq. In a 15-minute speech during prime time in the US, Obama likened the Islamic State to a cancer, saying that it would take time to defeat them, comments that leave open the prospect of an extended and open-ended campaign.
I've made it clear that we will hunt down terrorists who threaten our country wherever they are. That means I will not hesitate to take action against ISIL in Syria as well as Iraq. This is a core principle of my presidency. If you threaten America, you will find no safe haven.
Well, President Obama also announced that he would shore up support for Syrian rebels fighting Bashar al-Assad. His comments were welcomed by the Syrian National Council President Hadi al-Barra, who said the Syrian coalition stands ready and willing to partner with the international community, not only to defeat ISIS, but also to rid the Syrian people of the tyranny of the Assad regime. He went on to say that Assad's government was the root cause of the violence, brutality and sense of impunity prevailing in Syria. So is President Obama dragging the US once again into conflict? Let's put that to our guests on today's programme. From London, we're joined by Julian Barnes-Dacey, Senior Policy Fellow in the Middle East and North Africa programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. From Istanbul, Ambassador Richard Murphy, former US Ambassador to Syria and Saudi Arabia. And from Washington, D.C., Andrew Tabler, Syrian Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Gentlemen, welcome to Inside Story. Ambassador Murphy, if we can start with you. For 3 years, President Obama has resisted American military involvement in Syria, where I suppose you could argue that Assad's forces have committed atrocities just as barbarous, if not more so, than those committed by Islamic State. And yet, even though the president acknowledges that Islamic State doesn't yet pose a direct threat to the United States, he's going to go after them. What are we to make of that?
Well, I think that the beheadings of the two American journalists gave a sudden focus to the whole story as far as the American public, Congress, and White House are concerned. But you're absolutely right. Two beheadings compared to what's been going on in Syria the last 3 years, it's a limited menace. Now, it does bring into sharper focus, though, the criticisms of President Obama in the Congress, among some of our public, that he has not been a leader. He's been just watching and letting develop a crisis which could have been avoided, and I think that's absolutely false interpretation.
Julian Barnes-Dacey in London, what are we to make of President Obama's strategy for defeating Islamic State, particularly in Syria? He seems to be trying to equate this strategy to the way in which he's pursued targets in Yemen and Somalia. Will that work?
Sure, thank you. Well, I think, the headline news is that Obama is finally talking about actually doing something in Syria, but actually I think what is interesting is that he still is embracing quite a minimalist strategy. In fact, he doesn't really have a strategy. He's talking about airstrikes against the Islamic State, but in a very limited, narrow way. And I think what you don't see in Syria, as compared to Iraq, for instance, is any real sense of how to address the broader problem, which is feeding the extremism and the ongoing conflict there. And so you talk about some limited airstrike, you talk about some limited arming of the rebels, but there isn't any real capacity to talk about and to sense how you actually going to address the political problems, the civil war that is fueling that conflict.
Andrew Tabler, why would the president's strategy be any more successful, do you think, against Islamic State in Syria when it has failed to strike a decisive blow to militants or to improve the stability of either Somalia or Yemen?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that what you're suggesting is that it's a counterterrorism strategy, but there are, in this case, definite political components and military components, and in that there's a lot of work to be done, particularly the program with the Syrian opposition. Remember that the program he talked about before Congress is what we call a Title 10 program. It's an overt program that's subject to congressional scrutiny. There is a much larger and already up and running for years Title 50 or covert program. And those will be grafted together or joined together, and the approach of neighbors and allies will be key to this. But the strategy that he outlined, and I agree with Julian, is very limited, is going to take years to achieve, and there are doubtless going to be a lot of twists and turns.
Andrew, do you agree with what Julian was saying about this, the danger that this strategy could actually end up feeding further extremism?
I don't know how. Well, I suppose it could get more extreme. Unfortunately, we've had what's referred to in government circles as an evil symbiosis, and Ambassador Murphy referred to this as well. On the one side, you have the Islamic State and their atrocities to very nice and accomplished journalists. On the other hand, you have the Assad regime, which has been carrying out mass atrocities and I think which can be described as basic war crimes, if not more, for 3 years on the Syrian people, with increasingly rigid positions. And the breakdown of the talks in Geneva, I think, were indicative of that earlier this year. I think what we're going to see is a partition of Syria for the foreseeable future, and maybe that's appropriate given what we've seen by both sides over the last few years.
Ambassador Murphy, you touched upon this issue of President Obama's leadership. To what extent does he only have himself to blame for the rise of Islamic State in Syria by undermining and weakening President Assad, by calling for his removal, by not fully backing the Syrian opposition? Surely the US and its allies have allowed Islamic State to flourish, haven't they?
Well, there's been a vacuum. There's been a struggle in Syria. The opposition has not pulled itself together and to provide a viable program that could be looked at hard by the Syrian public as an alternative to the Assad regime. The regime has played with the issue in the recent past when there was fighting going on between what's called the Free Syrian Army and the Islamic State forces. They have hit the Free Syrian Army with their air power from Damascus, and in that sense favored the Islamic State. That's turned now. But I think what it emphasizes is a very elusive target in the Islamic State. And language such as "we're going to destroy it" is deceptive. What's needed now and what Secretary Kerry is launching is a major effort to bring the Arab countries directly concerned into a more coherent opposition to the Islamic State. That's going to be a tough job, but it's underway now.
Well, President Obama also announced that he'll be stepping up support for Syrian rebels as part of this strategy for the region. His Secretary of State, John Kerry, as the ambassador was saying, is currently in Saudi Arabia, a country that's agreed to host training camps for the rebels. That marks a significant escalation of support for Syria's opposition, which has complained that it's been largely abandoned by the international community. Julian Barnes-Stacey, this plan to train and support moderate fighting groups in Syria, will it actually work, do you think? What are the dangers? And is it training that they need or just more effective weapons?
Well, to be honest, I'm not convinced that this is a major shift. We've seen covert arming training going on for some time now, and I think that Obama remains very hesitant about how effective this can be, rightly so in my view. I think that it's clear that a military fight against the Assad regime, backed by the likes of the Iranians and the Russians, is not going to go anywhere fast. It's clear that a two-front war on behalf of the rebels against both Assad and against ISIS is something that is only going to weaken them that is going to be hard to gauge, to do effectively when you have these multiple fronts. So I don't think that Obama is really invested in this. I think that he is very much viewing this through a counter-terrorism lens for the moment. He wants to strike through airstrikes, some limited training which will try and empower the Sunni opposition in areas. But effectively, I think we're in a holding pattern, hoping that we can keep the Islamic State in a box to a certain extent, and expect or hope that perhaps the regional mood, the political move, some sense that some openings could emerge on the political front might perhaps give new opportunities down the line. But I really don't expect us to be looking at a powerful effort by the US government administration to get behind the Sunni rebels, to fight the Islamic State, to fight Assad, because frankly they would need so much. And I just don't think either Obama or even regional allies, I mean the Saudis or Jordanians, others who are talking about this, none of them are really prepared to invest in what it would seriously take to deal a knockout blow to either ISIS or to Assad.
Andrew Tabler, is that a view that you'd agree with?
I think the Saudis are the big change here. They apparently are quite eager to go forward with this program with the Syrian opposition. The Jordanians and the Turks have been more hesitant, mostly because I think they fear terrorist attacks in their own country, either run by ISIS or jihadists or Assad or both. Those are very real concerns. But I think that what we're likely to see is, if we think of Syria as a whole, which it hasn't been for some time, then these problems seem enormous and there is no answer. If you look at Syria as divided, and will be divided for the foreseeable future, then I think there are things that can be achieved. And in that sense, there could be a regional accommodation where the Iranian forces are essentially bookends to contain this east and west, but ultimately to contain it north and south and to defeat it, you need Sunni powers. You need Turkey, you need Jordan, you need Saudi Arabia, and you need the Syrian opposition. Syria is a majority Sunni country, as it is now. And until you have that, you can't defeat ISIS. And until that happens, the Islamic State is here to stay.
Ambassador Murphy, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, they all have far more at stake in this than the US when it comes to Islamic State. To what extent then will President Obama and this coalition that John Kerry is building expect them to do much of the legwork? And what are the problems with that, given that the Turks don't trust the Iranians, and neither the Turks or the Iranians are that comfortable with Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's well put. There is a great deal of mistrust throughout the region at this point in time. The one thing that seems to be uniting them is a concern that this Islamic State is an ideology that could flame even higher and burn other regimes in the region. And they're going to put some muscle into keeping that from happening. But I repeat, it's not something that you destroy with airstrikes, granted. It's an ideology, and you have to combat it with more powerful ideology than has been seen yet in the region.
Julian Barnes-Dacey, let's put a similar question to you then. Can Iran, Saudi Arabia and Turkey really put aside their differences to fight this common cause, Islamic State? Do you think that's realistic?
Well, after 3 years of a war in Syria in which they have been fighting each other through proxies, it's clearly a long shot. And I think that the deep divisions that we're seeing across the region are pretty firmly entrenched, and there's no easy way out. But I think, as the ambassador was saying, I mean, there is critically this new opening represented by the common threat posed by the Islamic State. It's clear that the Saudis and the Iranians particularly view the Islamic State as a direct threat. And so I think the question is whether that can be leveraged towards some kind of regional accommodation in Syria that would only begin the process of pushing back against the Islamic State. As has been said, I mean, they are deeply entrenched. It's not just about military strikes. It's about getting local Sunni communities to push back against this movement, against this ideology. And some kind of agreement between the Saudis and the Iranians, which, let's not forget, has already happened to a certain extent in Lebanon, has happened to a certain extent in Iraq, so it's not inconceivable. I think there is room to maneuver if explored, if pushed. could begin a process. But I think, if we are going to go down that path, we're going to need to see the Americans get engaged in trying to support it. And continued rhetoric about Assad must go now or the urgency of regime change is not really going to help that process forward. I think it's more about trying to find some common ground, some compromise, some kind of power-sharing, inclusive deal, however far-fetched that might seem, that tries to bring some of these players together.
Andrew Taylor, it's interesting that President Obama in his speech didn't talk about anything other than the military mission to deal with Islamic State. He didn't talk about the diplomatic mission that John Kerry is undertaking right now. If John Kerry can leverage, as Julian was saying, apply enough leverage to bring about some sort of regional accommodation, would that mean a shift, do you think, in alliances in the Middle East? And what about Qatar? What's role? Jen Psaki was talking about Qatar on Wednesday evening. What would its role be in all of this?
Really good questions. I think the outreach right now is to allies. How that applies to the Iranians remains to be seen. As you know, the way the Iranian regime is structured, the moderates or those that were, they are dealing with the nuclear file. The regional file is handled differently, mostly by the Quds Force, and it's there that until now they've backed Assad. We'll see what happens in the end. At the end of this, I doubt a political accommodation is possible while Assad remains, and that includes in a regional accord. But we're years away from that. The role of Qatar is interesting because Saudi Arabia has stepped in, particularly when it comes to the Syrian opposition. But Qatar has been playing a mediatory role. They've also been playing a mediatory role now, it seems, with the release in trying to get Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate, to release prisoners in southern Syria. And today, thank God, the UNDF soldiers were released of the 45 Fijians. And I expect that Qatar will play that continued mediatory role going forward.
Ambassador Murphy, perhaps the elephant in the room here, or perhaps not. I want to hear your opinion. Russia, where does Russia stand in all of this? How can you launch strikes against targets inside Syria without consulting or bringing on board President Assad's main ally, Russia?
I think that an effort is bound to be made with Moscow, and I don't believe that we will find resistance to the idea of confronting ISIS. Remember that among the reasons that President Putin has stood by Bashar al-Assad all this period, very steadily, very consistently, handsomely in terms of loans, arms, is his concern based on the situation in Chechnya and the nervousness, if you will, that an infection such as ISIS represents could further cause further problems within Russia. So I think that there will be ways of accommodating. President Obama made clear that he's not moving in support of Bashar al-Assad. But if Assad is going to be fighting ISIS and we're combating ISIS, I don't think that it's impossible to imagine an agreement with Moscow.
Yeah, you say that the president says that he's not supporting President Assad or fighting alongside, but France's foreign minister has warned that striking Islamic State in Syria could be interpreted as tacit support for President Assad. How does President Obama then sell that tricky dilemma to the rest of the coalition that his Secretary of State is trying to build right now?
Well, I think that's why he's being extremely cautious, despite words like destroy ISIS. I think he's very much aware that there's a need to craft a better front to combat ISIS, and that he will do so in awareness of his own stand that he considers President Assad has lost legitimacy as a leader. But he's not saying I'm about to move in and bring him down. So the French foreign minister has a good point. It's going to be interpreted as support for the regime, and that's not the president's intention.
But this campaign surely is going to end up benefiting President Assad, isn't it, Julian Barnes-Dacey? It is President Assad who controls the main armed opposition to Islamic State in Syria right now, after all. What happens to areas that are cleared of Islamic State in Syria by President Obama's military mission? Surely Assad's forces would simply move in and retake that ground, wouldn't they, given the current weakness of Syrian opposition forces?
Well, I think that's what remains to be seen, to be honest. It's a big unknown. No one really knows how this is going to play out. There are elements, people that say that Assad will be empowered by the defeat of the Islamic State, but let's not also forget that these are territories that are Sunni majority populations. These are areas of the country that have long ago turned on Assad. So if there is an opposition that has the correct positioning, it could fill that void. And really that is one of the big unknowns. But I think, I mean, whichever way that falls, I think that doesn't mean an end, or it's not going to empower one of the two sides dramatically. And I think that's what Obama continues to recognize. I mean, he didn't talk about Assad must go in his speech yesterday. He talked about the continued need to find some kind of political solution to this, because whichever way this shifts, if it's a regime or the opposition that makes some gains from these airstrikes, you're still going to see a profound political crisis, a civil war that is ripping the country apart, feeding extremism, and that's going to have to be addressed. And I think one shouldn't get too distracted, in a sense, by who's going to be the immediate tactical victor from these airstrikes.
Andrew Tabler, the president insists that the US's role in going after Islamic State in Syria will be limited to airstrikes and logistical and financial support. But to be effective, those airstrikes will surely need to be followed by some sort of ground operation. Who on the ground in Syria, given the weakness of Syrian opposition forces right now, could fulfill that role? Or do you see it perhaps needing some sort of external forces going in? And if so, what would be the implications of putting another fighting force into the midst of what is an ongoing conflict?
Well, I think that they're not going to be reinventing the wheel. There are more moderate groups, not necessarily liberal ones, besides the Islamic State. They would probably fill up some of those areas, but as Julian pointed out, that's really remains to be seen. I think what Obama recognizes is that the Assad regime is crippled and the Syrian opposition has serious weaknesses. Now, that could be bolstered by forces that are trained and enter via Turkey, Jordan, and across the frontier, perhaps via Saudi Arabia or from Saudi Arabia via Iraq up the Euphrates Valley. I expect that's what we'll see. Well, is that going to happen next week or even next month? No. That will be part of a much more longer-term program. And that I expect will begin with securing the border crossings and trying to deny ISIS the border crossings into Turkey. They can do that by working with the Kurds or with more moderate battalions, and we take it from there.
All right. Ambassador Murphy, I have a feeling this will be the last question on today's program, but to what extent might US airstrikes in Syria lead to consequences that are as yet unforeseen? I appreciate this is a difficult question to answer, but I'm just, you look at what's happened in Iraq following the invasion and subsequent US occupation.
I think President Obama is keenly aware of the box that he's in, and that he wants to move very carefully so that whatever bombings take place do not destroy institutions such as the Syrian army, or can be focused in a way that will send a clear message to the region that this enemy is a common enemy, and there are going to have to be a number of ways that they will come together to fight that enemy. And bombing is not going to be the sole, or probably not going to be the major answer to the problem.
Gentlemen, there we will have to leave it. Many thanks indeed for being with us on this edition of Inside Story. In London, Julian Barnes-Dacey. In Istanbul, Ambassador Richard Murphy. And from Washington, D.C., Andrew Tabler. And thank you for being with us. Don't forget, you can always add your thoughts to our discussion by leaving your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.